Hello, I'm Tom Easton. I'm the American Finance Editor with The Economist magazine. And I'm here to interview John Macy, a professor of law at Yale University. And we're going to be discussing the restructuring of the American economy through the restructuring of its finance sector through the imposition of very, very powerful broad-based new laws, which is often known as Dodd-Frank. Professor Macy, I'm delighted that you're here talking to me today. I would like to begin by asking you to reflect on some of the things The Economist has said about this new broad regulation. When it was passed 18 months ago, we wrote in The Economist, its success rests on a simple question. Does it make another crisis significantly less likely? And let me ask you two questions. Do you think the success of that regulation rests on that one simple question? And if it did, do you think this broad, profound restructuring of America's financial laws have actually made a crisis less likely?
My answer to both those questions is no. What the statute does is to require that certain financial institutions are identified as systemically important. What that does, contrary to the assertions of the people, Chris Dodd and Barney Frank, whose names are on the statute, what this does is identify financial institutions as being too big to fail. Those institutions have a very big competitive advantage. If we'd had Dodd-Frank in place and running at the time of the financial crisis, how much would it have constrained regulators? Could we have had, would the Lehman Brothers failure, for example, have been authorized under the statute? Would the Bear Stearns acquisition by J.P. Morgan Chase have been consistent with the statute? And the answer is yes to everything.
So what type of regulation do you think it is if it's not a public-spirited regulation or approach?
I think it is a full employment bill for lawyers and regulators. But what the entire infrastructure of Dodd-Frank is, it can be simply explained. It's an 1,800-page statute. It's massively complex. But at its core, it says this is only an outline. And what we're doing in these statutes is to require the creation of a bureaucracy, whether it's a new bureaucracy to figure out which institutions are systemically important, or a new bureaucracy to promulgate consumer protection rules. There are dozens of new bureaucracies created by Dodd-Frank, and it says we're creating new bureaucracies willy-nilly. Go forth and do good, meaning go forth and make up these regulations, promulgate these regulations that will solve all these problems.
The banks are lobbying like crazy to stop many of these provisions. How do you think this process is working in terms of the interaction between financial institutions and regulators?
I think that this was totally predictable. And I don't think that there's certainly no disappointment and no surprise to regulators that they're being deluged with lobbyists. It reminds me of these bills that used to be proposed by the City Council of the City of Chicago when Chicago was the big stockyard of America and the place where meatpacking was done. And every now and then, the City Council would propose what was known as a milker bill. And the milker bill would say something like, the train tracks that come into Chicago should be widened by 7 inches or narrowed by 10 inches. And this would put tremendous economic burden on the railroads because they'd have to go to a certain point and stop and then transfer all the cargo to the new trains. And no one really thought these bills were going to do any good, but they sure enabled the City Council of Chicago to line its pocket. It's even better than the milker bill, because in the milker bills, they just propose these nutty things. Dodd-Frank, they actually promulgate it, and they're saying, if you don't want this thing taken away, you better help me out in my re-election campaign.
Looking briefly back in 140 years of regulation in the United States, you've had a couple pivotal moments. You had Lincoln's efforts to create the controller of the currency to look at banks. You had the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. You had the Glass-Steagall Act in the 1930s, and now you have Dodd-Frank. The first three periods each had kind of defining philosophies that animated what they tried to accomplish. And of course, none of them was perfect, and the system continued to have the upheaval, notwithstanding actually the expectations of many of the authors. Now we have a new bill that's far, far more inclusive. What would have been a better way to draft a bill or a better idea behind a bill, if in fact any bill at all was needed?
We need to have a system, and this is a complete solution to financial crisis, in my view, in which instead of externalizing risk, where these people are literally running businesses where they get all the benefits on the upside and the risks are socialized through too big to fail policy, we need to make these guys internalize their own the cost associated with their risk-taking activity. And in my perhaps radical view is that we do this, but only for small firms. And when a firm becomes too big, it's either too systemically important or too politically important or something to fail. Well, if we can't make a credible commitment as a country to refrain from bailing out these financial institutions, then we ought to break them up into parts that can be digested in case they fail and can actually be allowed to fail. The regulators and the politicians have won this sort of war of words where they have convinced everybody that these institutions can't be broken up for whatever reason, and that they can't be allowed to fail.
And in this case, Macy's law, rather than Dodd-Frank, could be a page.
It would be, yeah, it would be a page. In my view, if somebody can't understand a law by looking at it for 8 hours straight, which nobody thinks they can do with Dodd-Frank, it's probably something suspicious. One ineluctable reality about Dodd-Frank is that citizen participation declines as the cost of citizen participation goes up. Well, no one can argue that the cost of citizen participation presented by the Dodd-Frank statute is anything other than prohibitive, even for people who do this full time, like me.
That's a great way to end. Thank you very, very much.
Great, thank you.